The campaign School of Something was recently co-organized by the General Department of Disaster Prevention and Mitigation under Vietnam's Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Development and the United Nations Development Program UNDP with the support of the Japanese government. This is part of the UNDP project on raising awareness and preparedness for tsunami in Asia and the Pacific. The campaign raises awareness for students in selected schools throughout Vietnam through education and training activities on tsunami and natural disasters such as something admission, something training, and something safety.
Con cảm thấy buổi tập huấn này rất bổ ích vì nó mang lại cho con những kỹ năng như là sơ cấp cứu, đóng bào, sóng sét, vân vân. Và sau những buổi học này con sẽ về và tuyên truyền lại cho những người thân, những người mà con quen biết để họ có được những kỹ năng khi mà bão hoặc là sóng thần đến.
It is very important to raise the awareness of the natural disasters among the young generation. Like for example, 5 years ago in Japan, so there was a strong earthquake and then following a strong tsunami, which deprived a lot of life of the young generations. Because the young people do not know how to do in the case of the natural disasters.
One of the most common reasons for natural disasters to become increasingly dangerous is a lack of awareness as well as ineffective disaster response as they occur. In the context of climate change becoming more complex, accumulation of knowledge on disaster response is extremely necessary, especially for children. Hello, you're watching Sharing Vietnam. Natural disasters are increasingly and extremely complex in the world. In Vietnam, during hurricane season, students in the flood-affected areas are particularly badly impacted. Today, let's have a talk with Ms. Caitlin Whitson to get more insights of the project that UNDP is working on to raise awareness of and prevent natural disaster, including the Something School campaign. Hello, thank you for joining our show today. So who was the most vulnerable to natural disaster and from the recent Typhoon Damri? How do you think Vietnam should improve natural disaster prevention?
Thank you. It's a very important question. And those who are among the most vulnerable to disasters are those who are elderly, those who are disabled, those who are young, and those who are vulnerable. And for them, it's absolutely critical in the early days to be able to find safe shelter. I would say that the government of Vietnam has been extremely proactive in this case and is doing a lot of good work on the ground. And there's still, unfortunately, more to come. One of the areas that is extremely important in this context is shelter and sustainable housing. And right now, UNDP and the government of Vietnam are working on a Green Climate Fund program. And in that program, we're developing what we call storm resilient housing. So it's housing for poor people and those on the vulnerable coastal areas that can withstand the next storm and floods. It can withstand storms up to 12 to 14 level, which is really quite high. Another key measure is really about awareness. This is really building disaster awareness and understanding when a disaster hits and it impacts, what do you need to do? What are the first actions you need to do? So that kind of preparedness is absolutely key. Then the second thing that's very important to do is also looking at how can we reduce the risks to disaster for all the different infrastructure and economies. The third and final one would be looking at how to integrate disaster risk reduction across all sectors. And this includes sectors, not just infrastructure and economy, but also education. And reaching children early on is absolutely critical in that process. We really want to take what we call a whole of community approach, one that engages youth, through the schools, and one that engages the elderly and the vulnerable and those, so that we have a whole of community response to disaster.
I know that recently UNDP just launched the Something School campaign. So do you mind sharing with us more about this campaign?
Thank you so much for asking about this campaign. Tin, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Yes,
Tin.
Yeah.
Yes, it's a legend, as you know. And this is really, it's the legend about when the spirit of the sea rose up. But even as it rose up with all the waters and the storm, it was not able to defeat Tin, the mountain. And so that's the name that we've given to the campaign to remind children and others who are part of it that when there's a flood, when there's a tsunami, it's time to get to higher ground. And this has really been a campaign to engage youth and engage them in the schools and to really bring together education, tsunami drills, and awareness raising so that students are really prepared next time around. We've engaged adults as well and families in the process. So far, we've reached about 3,000 people, I think, with the campaign, and we're hoping to do more.
So does UNDP have any method to ensure that this campaign is truly effective in long term, rather than just a temporary movement?
And I think one of the early things we've been able to do with the campaign is really create a movement. It's a movement where many people have been involved. It's also involved, and I think part of the attraction to it has been the engagement of some of the local celebrities. But your question is very good, how to sustain this afterwards, and that's absolutely critical. And what we want to do to ensure that this is sustainable is really integrate some of the training, key training and drills components into the school programs themselves. So this should be incorporated as a regular part of the education program, and drills should be held every year. It's something we need to have very much at the forefront of our mind so that when and if a disaster strikes, there's no question. Everyone knows what to do.
As part of the campaign School of Something, traditional games were held at the area of Hoàn Kiếm Lake, the center of Hanoi, to raise awareness of tsunami risk and of disaster prevention. Although traditional and folk games are very popular in Vietnam, but educating disaster prevention through these methods is still new. Through these games, students, teenagers, and children will be equipped with the knowledge and skills that can save them in the case of natural disaster hits. According to the plan, in the beginning of 2018, UNDP will continue to organize disaster preparedness and education activities in Ninh Thuận and Ho Chi Minh City within the framework of the campaign School of Something. In addition, UNDP will coordinate with the Ministry of Agriculture to organize a short film producing competition on natural disasters and disaster response. Shortly after the award ceremony is scheduled for the end of March 2018, these short films will be freely released in Hanoi to spread the knowledge throughout the community. Apart from UNDP, many activities have taken place in Vietnam to raise awareness of climate change and disaster response, such as EU Climate Diplomacy Fair, organized by the delegation of the European Union to Vietnam and the German Embassy. The exhibition targeted young generations in the hope that they will regulate their individual behavior appropriately to contribute to a more sustainable development. Besides, under the Pacific Partnership Program 2017, PP17, Da Nang People's Committee coordinated with the PP17 Command Organization to organize the training program on raising awareness on climate change and climate change response experiences. With trainees are officials in charge of disaster prevention, search and rescue at units and localities, members of the working group to assist the steering committee for response to climate change in Da Nang City. Such events are playing an important role in raising awareness of climate change among community, as Vietnam is considered one of the 10 countries most affected by natural disasters. Then how does United Nations assess the situation of natural disaster in the world and in Vietnam in particular?
The last decade has seen a tremendous impact and increase on extreme weather events. Vietnam, unfortunately, is among one of the top 10 vulnerable countries because of its thousands of mile-long coastline. Is extremely vulnerable to floods, to typhoons, to extreme weather, to droughts. So there's really a need to have a constant preparedness. And I would say the government of Vietnam has done a tremendous job in really tackling so many of the different dimensions of vulnerability. There's more that still needs to be done, however. And I think this is where we need to look at mainstreaming into core government programs, raising resources that will ensure that we're going to have storm-resilient housing, especially for those who are most vulnerable. So those who are poor, the elderly, the very young, the disabled, to make sure that they're protected the next time a storm comes.
And does the government play any role in raising awareness of natural disaster?
Government is playing a very important role in raising awareness in community, but I think it needs to move beyond government as well. We need to have a broad-based partnership, that we have a whole of society approach, because disaster awareness is something each one of us has to embody. Each one of us needs to know what to do in the event something happens. So we need that collective responsibility as well. So yes, the government is working hard, but many others can join forces and then to have a greater whole of community approach.
So according to you, how should each adult like you, like me, all of us should equip knowledge for ourselves and for our children in the family?
And I think one of the ways as parents, it's very powerful when the parents actually participate with their children in school in some of the programs. Another way is when children come back from school and share what they've learned, that parents take them seriously. And one of the things we found that's some very basic things, but very important, is that people who are living in coastal areas, whether they're adults, whether they're children, they really need to learn how to swim. That can be a vital life-saving skill. And then the other is to really come up with community disaster plans, ones that bring the whole community together in case a disaster happens, so that the whole of community can be resilient and not just a few.
Thank you for the information you shared today. Hopefully, with the efforts from UNDP, from the school and from the families, children who are most vulnerable to natural disaster will be truly aware of the importance of protecting themselves from natural disaster. And that's all for Sharing Vietnam today. Thank you for watching and see you next time.